Okay, today on Chris Loft Conversations, we've got Phil Enright, and you'll hear a remarkable story about his life. Began in Brisbane, has travelled the world in regards to his media businesses and being involved in many businesses, large and small. He was involved in the famous advertisement Louis the Fly, which has been one of the all-time favourites and a lasting advertisement that some of us oldies will remember. He very much is involved in the integrity in government. He has very informed opinions about the lack of integrity within all levels of government, and he's quite free to share his very precise analysis of that. So, welcome to the Chris Loft Conversation, and today we've got Phil Enright. And he's all the way from the USA and over, and I've grabbed him for this bit of a time. And we're going to have a conversation with Phil and find out where's he been, what's he doing, and what's the future look like. And so away we go. Now, Phil, we've got a rule here. We tell the truth. We tell the truth, or at least don't tell a lie.
Lovely.
Are you happy with that?
I'm extraordinary.
Okay, here we go. Where were you born? Let's start at the start.
Well, I'm told I was born in Brisbane and Ashgrove Private Hospital in 1952.
1952. I'm a 51, so we're close to the same.
We are.
Yeah. And from then on, so how many brothers, or where were you in the family tree?
I'm the middle one of three children. I have an older brother who's exactly 2 years older than I am to the day, but whose life has been hugely different from mine, and whose character and personality are hugely different from mine. So much for the horoscopes and stargazers. And then I have a younger sister who's nearly 5 years younger than I am, who lives in Brisbane. That's my mum and dad passed away 30 days apart in August, September 2015.
Right.
And there you have it. I have two children.
Yep.
By my second marriage.
Yep.
Which lasted 20 years, which it shouldn't have lasted.
Yeah.
And I now am married again, adventuresome soul, to a lovely Chinese-born and bred lady who spent the first 30 years of her life in China, in Mao's China, whose father was a major in Mao's Revolutionary Army. And she has two children, and we live in Northern California, in Sacramento.
Yep. You've been there for a little while.
Yeah, I've been working in and out of the States, well, ever since 1978, but I've been spending a lot of time there since basically 2013.
So just stepping back, so born in Brisbane, went to school in
Brisbane.
In Brisbane, yep, and school the whole way through.
Yes.
Yep, and then what from there? Like, what some of the achievements? Were you good at sport, or
I
top
was
of the class?
No, I was never top of the class. Although actually, that's not quite true. When I was in primary school, because my mum and dad felt they made a mistake having my brother start at 6 years of age, they started me at 4 years of age.
Oh, right.
And they realised when I was in about year 3 or 4 that wasn't such a great idea, and they wanted me to repeat. And in those days, in the 1950s, dumb bunnies were the ones who repeated.
Yep.
And you never wanted to be labelled a dumb bunny. So I was always threatened with repeating, and the bar was lifted higher and higher every year, to the point where I almost topped the class, in fact, in year 7. And they really wanted me to repeat year 7 at primary school, and I just wasn't going to let them. So I mean, you didn't study in primary school, but you certainly listened, and you worked harder, and I did. You know, I got 100% for maths in year 7, 100% for social studies. My English was my difficulty, and then I went off to Brisbane Grammar School, where finally they made me repeat year 11 because I would have been going to university far too young. And there once I was given that inevitability, I started to have a better time. I played rugby, which was my, I guess you'd say, my key sport, both at grammar and then at university, finishing my career with the under-19 Queensland side.
Yeah, right.
Playing in the curtain raiser to the Test match between Australia and South Africa in that incredible year of apartheid and demonstrations and Joe and all that sort of stuff. So it was an interesting time. My family on both sides had properties, so I spent a lot of school holidays on basically mustering sheep and to a lesser extent cattle for shearing. So I got to see a lot of. I mean, in those days, most Australians knew or had a relative who was on a farm somewhere, and so the understanding of rural life and the interest in rural life and the value of rural life in those days was very much greater than it is today, and hence there wasn't the divide that existed that exists today.
Yeah, yep. Which we'll get to talk about that a little bit later. So then uni, you did, what did you study at uni?
In those days, there was only 1970, I think James Cook started in 1970, but University of Queensland, in fact, had no business school at all. They had a Department of Commerce and Economics, which was basically accounting or economics. I never wanted to be an accountant in my mind, but there was nothing else I wanted to do, and so. And I didn't get a Commonwealth scholarship. There were fees in those days. So going to university part-time was what I had to do. And I worked first of all, in the National Bank. And I basically changed employer and industry every 12 months that I was at university. I changed from the University of Queensland because of its massive limitations, albeit it started to go beyond accounting and economics while I was there. But it still knew nothing, pardon me, of management or marketing, and hadn't gone into those subjects. It had gone into a bit of information technology. So I changed to what was then QIT and the Darling Downs Institute of Advanced Education, because at one point I was actually office manager and I guess you'd say de facto manager of Tangalooma Island Tourist Resort, which was an unsuccessful move on my part. So I had to go externally for a year, and as I say, that experience of changing industry and changing role was invaluable to give me an appreciation of what jobs actually existed in the economy, to be able to make an informed decision about what I should study at university. And it brought me at a very young age to the view that this notion of going from high school direct to university is the most flawed notion that you could imagine, because you have no idea. Most who go there have no idea, so it's not surprising they don't study very hard, and it's not surprising that the failure rate is so high. But amazingly, schools are still encouraging that same course and program direction to young students today, and crippling them with debt at the beginning of their adult life, which is even more insane. And it's much worse than the United States.
It's worse in the United States.
Oh, yeah, because the mothers of America are insane. They're the most materialistic group of people you'd ever come across. And they have this view that not only must little Johnny or little Mary go to college, but they should go on the other side of the country. So it massively increases the cost of education because they're going full-time, and it's invariably the student who's incurring the student loan. I mean, the United States students or adult population has 1.4 trillion, I think it is, of student loan debt for what are joke degrees for the most part, are general studies. Most young people, when they first go to college and for the first 3 years, are effectively repeating year 12 before they actually start into to do optometry, not ophthalmology, but optometry in the United States is an 8-year course at university, whereas here it's less than 4 or just on 4 now. It used to be 3 years, and the debt is $300,000. Here the debt might be $40,000 or $50,000. So the mothers of America really are a huge part of the problem for the United States.
So you did your part-time the whole way through?
Yeah, I had 1 year full-time.
So it took you about 6 years to do it?
Well, I actually never completed my undergraduate degree, which was initially an economics degree, because by that stage my career was going way ahead, and what I was learning in my career
Yeah.
just wasn't being taught at university, and what I needed to do at university wasn't being taught there. It was so backward. The schools were way behind what practice was.
Yeah.
And I, in my career, moved fairly quickly into doing programs that my employers were paying for. I went to Columbia University in my late 20s and did an advanced management program there in the States. So I recognised the monumental deficiencies and why there needs to be the very much closer link between universities and the business world here that there is in the United States.
Yeah, yeah. So then your employment, you're working for a boss. So you finished finishing the university. You did Tangalooma.
Yeah, that was one. That was my first job, as I said, was in the National Bank.
Yeah.
And then I worked. I'll try and get the order of this right. Then I worked a year with James Hardie, the building products company, and that was a great experience because there I started off as a sales clerk, and then after 6 months there, they recognised my desire and the need for me to get different experience. So I was then assistant financial accountant in building products here in Brisbane. And I was actually playing the money market for them, was part of my role. So
about when was that? Mid-70s?
We're now 1971, 72.
Yeah, right.
I had around a year as assistant credit manager with Commonwealth Industrial Gases, which again was an incredibly interesting experience, which included repossessing welders from builders who were failing, and apart from collecting the money each month from massive clients like Campbell's, whose account each month was about $50,000, and it was a phenomenal experience that I had in those roles. Yeah. Then I guess you'd say my first longer term was a role with Channel 9, where I started handling those clients who chose not to use ad agencies.
Yep.
And very early in the piece, I came to the view that to have a relatively small number of very large clients was going to be a whole lot more fulfilling and enjoyable than a whole lot of rats and mice. Although you had to have the rats and mice as well. Yeah. And so I actually handled EMI. First of all, it's record division, its electronics division, and they had an agency, Doyle Down and Bernbach in Sydney. But Doyle Down and Bernbach could not do anything for them like I could do for them. For instance, I got them to, in the very early days of Film Clips, I got them to sponsor a national rock show that I produced for them, and produced film clips for their artists like AC/DC, Mark Holden, John Paul Young. In those days, EMI, I think it was 80% of the plastic albums pressed around the world were pressed by EMI. 80% of the published music. So they were the client to have, and it was just an incredibly enjoyable...
For those young listeners, that's a record. That's the black piece.
That's it there.
It used to go
vinyl.
round and round.
Yeah, I think most of them are aware of vinyl. Vinyl seems to be staging something of a recovery at the moment, which will probably be short-lived. But no, so... And I handled people like Mad Barry's, a hardware chain. Some very large businesses. I handled computer companies, and
huge variety.
Yeah, and one of which I produced budget specials for, and specials for when there were federal elections. So I was working with people like Michael Schulberger, who was then the anchor of A Current Affair. So it was a phenomenally wide experience that I got, and I've always had through my career, which gives me a fairly unique perspective that sees me being labelled a know-it-all by many people. Because I've literally worked now in every industry other than mining, with small organisations and the very largest global corporations. Because after my 5 years with Nine, and the reason I left there, they all said, "You'll be back, Phil, you'll be back, this is too good a life." I said, "No, I won't be back." But the reason I left was I recognised I'd stopped learning there, and at 28 years of age as I was too young to stop learning. And I then embarked on 3 years, which included, first of all, a company that was supplying about 6% of the beer market via home brew in Australia, and I was marketing manager of that. And they diversified into refinishing products for cars and buoyancy vests and life jackets in the name of Marlin International. So they were in Brisbane or Beenleigh, Sydney, and in Europe. So I got experience working across then Europe and Western Europe with that organisation. I went there because a client that had the home brewing company had followed me from there, and the first interim step I had was 12 months or 13 months, 2 weeks and 3 days, but who's counting? With Ogilvy,
that's a memory. Yeah.
With Ogilvy and Mather, the global advertising agency group. When I was with Nine, because I had such tremendous clients that were spending so much money, of course agencies wanted to employ me, thinking that the clients would find me. And I recognise agencies did a very poor job then of hiding their innermost selves from the media. They obviously wanted to hide their innermost selves from their clients as to how they were ripping them off, but they didn't hide very much from the media. So I was acutely aware of their shortcomings and the greed that drove and the incompetence that drove most of them. And it was only when Ogilvy and Mather came to Brisbane that, with a managing director who basically was reporting directly to the head of Ogilvy and Mather in Australia, who was also a smart guy and who'd come out of London. And I got carried away with David Ogilvy's magic lanterns and could see I could learn a hell of a lot. So I went there. But I found that while that was the global persona of the business, the Australian persona was just like every other agency. And so I pulled out of there when I saw them committing fraud against their clients, as they were. One of whom, and that client who'd followed me there, it was the first and only time I ever left a job without having a job to go to. But the client who'd followed me there said, "Look, we're looking at starting up in the UK with this, and you've grown our home brewing business hugely. So would you like to come and work for us?" And there was nothing else on my plate that was going to pay the bills. Not that I had many bills. So I joined them, and I was with them for 3 years. And
over there, overseas.
Well, out of Australia, but I lived in London and worked in London as a base. But we had a factory that it wasn't their factory or wasn't our factory. It was one of the shareholders of the company over there had a factory in just outside Manchester at Macclesfield. And that was with the automotive refinishing products that we were supplying into Western Europe and starting to look at the American market. So yeah, it was a phenomenal experience. So I worked with Australia's largest retailers in growing home brew in the Australian marketplace, and they were grocery retailers and hardware stores and health foods. And so I got a phenomenal view of the retail world. And indeed of industrial products. So it was just a phenomenal experience.
So just as we advance then, so that's around...
We're now at 73 to 78.
Yep.
I was with Nine, and then 78, 79 to 81 was doing that with the group of companies, you'd say, between Australia and Western Europe. And then I started my own consultancy, which was too early. The marketplace was, I guess you'd say, not sophisticated enough to appreciate the value.
Yeah, in early 80s.
Yeah. And so I was, I don't say ahead of my time in an egotistical sense because it was a mistake, but I recognised that I was going to have a base to provide this kind of input. And at that time, Clemenger, which was 45% owned by BBDO, they were one of the businesses and their clients I was helping in the form of Caboolture Dairy Co-op as they were then. Ultimately, they became Queens Co, Unity, and Dairy Farmers, and I handled them through most of those evolutions throughout the 80s, which was again phenomenal. For Clemenger, yeah, with what is now Clemenger BBDO.
And they're basically a consultancy worldwide.
Well, they're a global ad agency group. As I say, I joined them here in Brisbane. I was on the Australian board. I joined them in 83, I think, January 82. Joined them in January 82. By June, July, I was on the national board, and then worked. I didn't work in it, but worked with US clients or global clients, but mainly it was always based out of Brisbane here on the Australian board.
Mm. So advancing from there after.
Well, then that takes me through to 1990, when I started my own in a very deliberate way, because I gave them a lot of notice, namely nearly 8 months' notice of leaving, and I left them on June 30, 1990 to start my own marketing and communications consultancy. The reason that I did that and decided to leave there was I could see the model of the advertising agency was hugely flawed, and that I saw that by virtue of working with BBDO agencies all around the world. They sent me to advanced management programs, a number of them, both those that they coordinated with colleges in the United States, like Columbia, Berkeley, their leading business schools, but also I went to some of the colleges programs, and I saw, and I was meeting there in those programs guys who were running the agencies in the other 40 countries around the world, and a number of those agencies, BBDO agencies, were working on not on commission and service fee, which motivates the agency to give very poor advice that's in their interest rather than the client's interest, to get, namely, to spend more money on advertising, which is usually not a good thing to do, rather than focusing on the other things in the marketing mix. So what is basically the consultant form of remuneration is what existed, for instance, in most of Western Europe, and I saw that just made for a much more professional agency, and I argued for that case on the board, but because of the very much more profitable way that the other was, there was no one interested. I was one of 12 on the board of Clemenger BBDO in Australia, or Clemenger Australia, and I was a lone voice.
No one else could see it.
Well, they didn't want to see it. I mean, they could see the logic of it, I'm sure. You know, they weren't stupid. But clearly they were more driven by short-term parameters than the longer term, and more self-satisfied. I've never really been driven by money. I thought, in fact, I was lucky in the time I was with Clemenger to spend a bit of time working with Bryce Courtney, who was a phenomenal author who's passed away now, but he was also one of Australia's leading admin in the 70s and 80s. He wrote the famous Willie the Fly, or whatever his name, the Fly, for Mortine. Louis the Fly.
Louis the Fly.
Louis the Fly, not Willie. Louis the Fly. And Bryce and Bryce and I worked together on a presentation for the board. I mean, he wrote it in his style, but he and I discussed the content. And as he said, it was always his view that if he focused on doing a great job, the money would look after itself. And that had always been my philosophy. I mean, throughout the whole of my career, I didn't change jobs for more money. In fact, I started working for Nine on $105 a week, paying $16 a week tax, and getting a $16 a week car allowance, which has made $105 all up. And I had declined 2 jobs with computer firms where I would have been given a company vehicle and paid $160 a week. So that demonstrates the criteria by which I was making decisions, and it served me well. My career grew at a phenomenal rate, and I got much more experience than
plenty of contacts and all, just.
I mean, I was never looking so much for the context. It was just always the quality of the experience and the growth that I was always looking for. But yes, I met a lot of people, most of whom were not too wonderful, I'd have to say. I mean, I had clients that one of whom offered me a pair of cement shoes if I didn't drop an existing client and handle his nightclub. And that guy became a very successful Queensland based business person. I mean, I had them all. I mean, the White Shoe Brigade, you name it. So it gives you phenomenal insight into what works and what doesn't work.
And it was around late 80s also, was the interest rates went to 18%. You know, for your little household.
In fact, they visited there in the late 70s as well. I mean, I remember when I was working in England and based in England, I think interest rates that some people were paying was as much as 24%.
Mm.
So it was, they were tough times.
Yeah.
And I mean, I naturally was a very, I guess you'd say, personally conservative financially.
Yeah.
I remember vividly my mum and dad not owning their home until my dad was 52 years of age, and the great celebration when that mortgage was finally paid off. And I swore to myself that I would never allow myself to be in that situation. So I'd paid off my own home by the time I was 30.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I worked damn hard, but I never wanted to be beholden to a bank or indeed anyone else, because I saw all through my career how debt completely dominated the decisions that you make with your career to your detriment. And in fact, in the time that I was with Clemenger, there was a guy who I think he might still be the finance director, a guy called Hilton Mackley, who was finance director of Clemenger Australia, Clemenger BBDO. And I'll never forget sitting in the boardroom here, at least in Brisbane, where he was having a discussion with another guy who we'd employed from Macius, and how they each hung on to good creatives, to good writers. And their strategy basically was to employ them, pay them more than they thought that they were worth, but to concurrently get them to buy bigger houses and bigger and brand new and expensive motor cars. So their debt were, like I said, handcuffs to them. Yeah. And that's how they hung up. And I thought, I just sat there shaking my head while these two had this argument. I thought, you mongrel dogs. And that I guess flavoured. I mean, I've seen it all. I mean, as I said earlier on, when you work in the media, as I did for 5 years, you see agencies operating with their clients. So you see that the whole, and it's all quite open. They really don't hide anything. No. Well, they didn't in those days. They've become, of course, far more discreet since they've been caught. I mean, some agencies have been threatened with prosecution for committing fraud against their clients. I remember there was one who committed phenomenal fraud against, I think it was the Commonwealth Bank, on a television commercial production budget, and the same thing was done, I recall very clearly, by one agency to Powers Brewing, to Bernie Power. Oh, yeah. And Bernie was, for those who were around in the 80s, this is when the Broncos were starting out, and Bernie was the founding sponsor of the Broncos and so on. He was a very vocal, outspoken fellow, and when he found out that this is what had been done to him, he was less than pleased.
See, for the people listening, Powers Brewery, they were really from outside that just came in and tried to bite into the
well, they did. They very
Forex market.
They were the first to start to break down the Forex monopoly. I mean, I pitched for Forex's business when I was with Ogilvy and Mather in 1978. And I visited because I recognised that when you've got over 80% market share, the solution is not going to be advertising. Mm-hmm. Advertising is fantastic at maintaining the loyalty of customers you've already won. But if you're losing them and you want to get them back, you're going to need to do other things. So I figured the only thing to do was to get into the trenches. And so I visited face to face the licensees and owners of 124 of Queensland's then 1,100 hotels, from Brisbane to Mount Isa and north as far as, I think it was north of Cairns, both big pubs and little country pubs, to get a really good understanding of the dynamics of the beer market. And again, I learned a hell of a lot there doing that. Yeah. But that was the beginning. When Powers came in, that was the beginning of the loss of the stranglehold. And since that time, it's my view that the breweries have been responsible to a great deal of the big breweries, the loss of market share and the explosion of craft beers and so on, which I don't think will last that long. They'll always be around, but they won't be the proportion. The consumer will wake up to the fact that they're really not that good. Yeah. It's very hard to make a good beer, and I learnt that from home brewing. And the best tasting beers, it's interesting that in those days, the profile of the taste profile of the leading beers was much the same, because 60% of people have much the same profile palate. It's what the connoisseurs call a pedestrian palate. Yeah. I have a pedestrian palate. which is why chicken is so popular, because crumb chicken, because it's flavoured with sauces, and people really aren't eating. It's not the chicken that people are loving; it's the sauces that they're loving.
Yeah. So we're up to about mid-90s.
Yeah, well, I started at my own, as I say, consultancy, which started off really as a marketing consultancy that did advertising, but I recognised very quickly that the problem as to why agencies were so bad in the way they operated with their clients was because the clients' marketing managers were hugely inexperienced and didn't know what the hell they were doing. So I recognised that what was needed was for me to shift my focus from being a marketing and advertising consultant / agency to a marketing and management consultancy, working with the CEOs and the senior management teams, because their marketing managers were changing. At that time, and we're talking the early 90s, there was a survey done that showed that the average tenure of a marketing director of the largest companies, both in Australia and the United States, was about 14 months, because that's how long it took for the company to wake up to how bad they were.
Yeah.
And they also knew that they were out of their depth. So the moment a marketing manager got in his new job, he would start looking for the next one, because he knew he was going to be discovered sooner rather than later. So that was the way in which I shifted the business, and it was very successful for me. I mean,
because back in those days it was more marketing - advertising. You'd spend a percentage of your turnover. It was nearly
that's what businesses were doing.
And they'd just spend 7% of their turnover, or some figure,
anywhere from 2. Or a little bit
and you
less
think
than
just
2
because you increase sales, it means it increases your bottom line. Not true.
The belief system that business was operating under was very flawed, and it still is very flawed today, because the blindness in relation to digital media is just as bad as the blindness was in relation to mass media then. I mean, the great tragedy is that media and communications is very, very poorly understood globally. There was a wonderful presentation given in 2014 by one of the most insightful guys I've ever read anything from, and his presentation that he gave to a global communications advertising conference in 2014 in Europe. It was an international conference, was titled "The Golden Age of Bullshit," and I would contend that the golden age of bullshit started way back when, basically post World War II, and has just gathered more and more momentum, and it hasn't lost any. I mean, the notion that it's effective advertising with these ads coming up while you're doing a search on Google is just laughable in the extreme. I mean, and advertisers are paying because their businesses, or at least the marketing of business, is now being run by kids who have an understanding of IT, but no understanding of communications and human behaviour. And that hasn't changed in millennia. There was a wonderful presentation given by a guy called Bill Bernbach at the Sydney Opera House back in the bicentennial year, and after it he was in a press conference, as there always is, and some journalist thought he was asking the question of the century, was what will the consumer of the new millennium look like? And this was in the 70s, or no, early 80s, and no one was even thinking about the term the new millennium at that point in time. Y2K wasn't thought of, and so you could hear a pencil drop in this, and Bernbach just rolled his eyes straight away, and he said, "My friend, the consumer of the new millennium will be no different to the consumer of this millennium, or indeed from the last millennium." He said, "I'm not concerned with changing man, I'm concerned with unchanging man." He said, the Dr. Strangelove with his finger on the nuclear button and the primitive caveman with the club in his hand will behave no differently in the same set of circumstances. It's just a technological capacity that changes the outcome. And that is so true. I've used that line in so many presentations because it sums up entirely where it's all at. And this is why it's so laughable that people think that the smartest thing they can do with their businesses is put it in the hand of a web designer who understands how to build a website but knows nothing about communication, knows about search engine optimization, but knows nothing about communication. So, yeah, it's. I mean, the marketing world is being as badly served today as ever it has been.
Yes, yeah. So, rolling through the years then, so you've run your consultancy and assisting different businesses over
Yeah, well, and I've always
through the
been
Y2K and then rolling onwards.
Well, I wasn't really involved too much in Y2K other than by the time that came around, and I'd been running my own business for 10 years. The thing that was quite unique about my business is that I recognised even before I started my own business, and it was really the basis on which I started it, was that the whole focus would be on relationship and database marketing rather than mass media.
Yep.
So I got into understanding that, and in fact had an alliance with what was then Telecom. Telecom in the 80s we had recognised the power of it, and they were a very powerful corporation, still government owned at that stage. And they were the importers, you'd say, of a software called Telemagic, which was the first PC-based database and communication system. And it was very, very well designed. It was back initially in the DOS world. Yeah. That's how early we're talking about. And I became, by about 1992, 93, the largest of about 6 resellers, agents, call it what you will, for Telecom's Telemagic, which was effectively the only database and communication software available in the marketplace. And I put that into Suncorp, their call centre, because it handled all of that. It had that technology built into it as well. And so I sold 160 licenses to them. I sold...
How much were they back in those days? What was roughly...
The value of that sale?
Yeah.
About $60,000.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just the sale. What I also did was I designed their databases for them to meet their needs. And I had 2 people working for me who did the installation and the training of their people to actually use it, because it had multiple security levels. It was very sophisticated.
Yeah.
And that was a foundation of my business. As I say, I was the largest agency in Australia and supplying it nationally out of Brisbane, and it gave my business a great platform. Apart from doing the consulting work that I was doing.
So that's client relationship management, sort of.
Absolutely, CMS, CRM systems,
it's
all
still
of those.
relative today.
Oh, more so than ever, because if you've got a website, no matter what you're doing, you've got to manage relationships with clients, and you've got to do it in a disciplined, proactive fashion. People work with people they trust and preferably like. It's more important that people be able to trust their advisors to do what's in their best interest than to particularly like them. And I've never lost sight of that fact. So it was hugely important and made the businesses very successful.
And so you rolled along here, based out of Brisbane?
Yes, indeed, all the way until the last decade, you'd say. And as I say, I became more of a management and marketing consultancy. I mean, of the client, one of my long-standing, I have had 2 very long-standing clients. One was Amcor Packaging, which was their carton board business. That was they became a client of mine in 1994 and were a client of mine until 2013 when they closed the Petrie Mill and no longer supplied carton board. They were the last supplier of carton board. Carton board is the board that your Kellogg's cornflakes packet is made of, or your Weet-Bix packet and so on, and biscuit packets, and you name it. They were the sole and indeed last manufacturer. From as early as 1994, that business was threatened with closure, not because it wasn't effective, but because of the Australian dollar being valued too high. And they invited 3 agencies, of which I wasn't one initially, to pitch for the business. They were prepared to spend $2 million back in 1994 to try. It was a lot of money to try and get the packaged goods manufacturers, the retailers and packaged goods manufacturers to use their carton board. and they were going to be buying commercial spots on things like 60 Minutes and all of those sorts of current affairs news type programs where the people who make the buying decisions in Woolworths and Coles and Kellogg's and Nabisco and so on, watch television when they do. And the guy who was their CEO knew had a relationship with someone that I had worked with quite a bit, and this fellow suggested to him that he really should have a talk to me as well as getting these agencies to pitch. And so I went out there to their Petrie Mill and we had it, and he laid the problem out as pretty much I've related it to you. And I said to him, well, all you're going to be doing is making a donation to Kerry Packer and Rupert Murdoch. I said, advertising is not going to solve this problem. I said, look at my background. I've worked with all of these companies, and particularly the retailers. I can tell you they have no interest, nor indeed do these packaged goods manufacturers have any interest in the environment or doing anything worthwhile with using recycled packaging. I said, I think there is, so that will be totally wasted and your mill will close. I said, that I can guarantee. I said, I can't guarantee what I'm about to suggest will work, but there's a good chance. It's the only chance you've got to save it. And I said, I suggest what you do is you run a national schools competition to create a logo that you get and a whole PR campaign around the creation of that logo through every school and every community right across the whole of Australia to design that logo in a campaign to promote that all consumers should be looking for products that bear this logo that says it's made from the packaging's made from recycled waste, and choose those brands that are. I said, I can't guarantee it'll work, but it's the best shot you've got. So that's what we did, and it worked. We got most of Australia's packaged goods manufacturers to buy into the campaign. We got Woolworths and Coles both initially to support it with point of sale material, shelf talkers and so on, and the whole competition was supported. The competition was run through all the schools of Australia, and so that campaign ran until you'd say from about 2009, 2010, again the Australian dollar moved back to and hit parity, and in fact $1.05 US to $1 Australian at one point in time, and that happened for a sustained period of time. I said to them, look, I did do economics. I know something about it. There's no way knowing the Australian dollar is sustainable at this rate. Live through it as you have before, and their management had become more short-sighted, as all managements had become, and they closed the mill in September 2013, by which time the Australian dollar was falling. But you have to make that decision a year out, which is what they did. But by the time they closed it, I think the Australian dollar was down about 85 cents, and of course now it's under 70 or around 70. So at which point that mill and that whole business would have been hugely profitable. And that's the tragedy of Australian business, that governments and large corporations have such short-term parameters and fail to recognise that to have the whole fortunes of the country in the hands of pimply post-adolescent schoolboys or college students who sit on money desks bartering and with currencies is just ridiculous. That we allow that to happen. But that's the way it is at the moment. Has been for quite a number of years.
So then you moved, you relocated to America not so long ago?
Well, I still live. I live across on both sides of the Pacific, and I still don't have a green card in the United States, and who knows if I'll ever get one, because we're now thinking of living the rest of our lives here in Australia.
Right.
But I've been spending most of the year there for the last 5 years, and I mean Jane and I only met in 2015. 2006, 15 years, 15, 16.
Yep.
And we are enjoying life there. I'm not working as in earning a paid income there. What I do in the United States is I've become involved with a community rebuilding program in Yuba and Sutter counties in Northern California, which is just outside Sacramento, which are farming areas that have been suffering for many years. And I coach and mentor businesses there, but I also run a life and career skills program for young people and the underemployed, and indeed for people in prison who are likely to be paroled at some point in time in the future. I've also been involved with drug rehabilitation and places involved with that, but I've lost all enthusiasm for that, because most people in drug rehabilitation, in my experience, are really only there because it's a better place to be than prison, so they agree to the courts to go and do drug rehab, but they're not really serious, or very few of them are. And so that's not terribly satisfying if you're running a program to help them. But in prisons particularly, the people who go into the program that I run are really serious about it. In fact, some of them are quite good business people. Some of them...
Well, they're very creative.
Well, no, it's not that they're not GBH violent type criminals. A lot of them have just found themselves in jail because they can't control their consumption of alcohol, and they've had 3 DUIs, which is 3 strikes, and so they're in prison. But you know, one of California's leading chefs was in one of my classes, and he owned 3 restaurants, and another one owned about 3 different panel shops, but was also getting vehicles, doing them up and shipping them back to El Salvador, where he came from, at about 10,000 profit a vehicle. So you got some very creative people, and they wanted to learn more about running better businesses. But lots of guys were just labourers and tradies who basically decided to turn their lives around. I refuse to donate money to charities because I've been involved with them now for 5 years, and I've seen how little they achieve. And in fact, there was a wonderful book written by a guy who's worked in the not-for-profit sector in the States and achieved amazing things he titled his book Toxic Charity. And he lays out the case for why, as they say in the classics, you don't give the man a fish, you teach him how to fish. And that's what I do. And that's what I'm involved in now very heavily with this program. And it's enormously rewarding. I've still got investments back here, but we're there for the moment. And as I say, we're looking at finally living here for the rest of our days.
Yeah, right. So locally here, the economy, we've chatted around this privately. What's needed here? Because we're low socio-economic, we're aged population locally, but...
You mean the local Maryborough, Harvey Bay economy, Fraser Coast?
Let's call Wide Bay, Fraser Coast.
The most significant organisation in this region is the council. It has the biggest budget, it has the largest workforce, and it's the most hopelessly managed and operated that you can come across. I built my house here in 2008, so it's now 11 years that I've been very involved with this area through, and what the elements were, most of which are to start off with identifying what are the key issues that impact the short, medium and long-term economic performance of the region. And what that requires is saying, well, where does the Fraser Coast have an inherent competitive advantage over other areas? And are those industries here? If they're not, some of them are already. The recreational vehicle industry is huge here. And a lot could be done to encourage and make this a massive centre for that. But they do nothing. And but then you also look at what other areas of competitive advantage you can potentially have, and what companies are significant in those industries, and you go and talk to them and you say, look, we will create incentives for you. We're not going to give you money, but what we can give you is very low cost land, very low cost rates for a period of time, to create the incentive for you to make it worthwhile
to relocate,
to relocate or to expand your business. Most large successful businesses are looking, and particularly if they're service based, are looking at bases beyond just one central head office. So, but of course they did nothing, and I don't think anything's changed. So that's been the great source of my frustration, that I've tried to steer the local leaders to that kind of a strategy that actually can work. Anything else is just it's just motherhood. I mean, it's tragic to see. I mean, I had an interview with again with one of your councillors who was so enthusiastic about what was happening with the sports thing and stuff, and I'd heard from other people. You know, my cousin lives here. How turning, shutting down some sugarcane farms was really threatening the viability of the mill, which employs 100 and something odd people, and the council's not even aware of it, or if it's aware of it, it's ignoring that fact and this enthusiasm for creating this sports precinct and making this a sports area. We just don't have the population to fill grandstands. I mean, it's Townsville can't even do it, let alone here. It's just, and he was so carried away with it. He said, "Oh, there's a Chinese company's going to invest 70 million and offer to make me a director." For God's sake, he didn't even realise the conflict of interest in a member of council becoming a director of a Chinese investment company. I mean, it's just bloody tragic. That's the level of competence we have. But that's true of politics the world over. I mean, politicians are bloody hopeless, which is why they defer their decision making pretty much to the administrators, the CEOs, who haven't got a clue either. So and that's how it all becomes very corrupted. I mean, and the Queensland government knows that. They've known it for bloody decades, and they're not interested in biting that particular challenge. So regions continue to suffer. The whole country continues to. There is no reason we need to have collapsed our manufacturing industry from around 35 to 40% that it was when I was first doing economics at university to now under 6% and shrinking. Back in those early 70s, the proportion of the American economy that was manufacturing was roughly the same as Australia, in that 35 to 40% zone.
What is it now over there?
Still there. It's still 35, very different 35 to 40%. It's about 34, I think, 33. But it's still massive. Its makeup is different. But they have never given up on the recognition that for national security, that you have to have a viable, broad-based manufacturing sector. I mean, we in some of our absolute necessities have less than weeks, days only supply of product for this country. Our available petroleum is tiny compared to what it really needs to be. We are incredibly vulnerable. And the great sadness is that our children now, because of that shrinking of manufacturing industry, the job opportunities that are available to young people today are a fraction of what they were when I was a young person. I mean, when you have companies that have got marketing managers, state sales managers, HR managers, and very, involved in manufacturing, there's a phenomenal range of jobs available to young professionals. They've gone. I mean, my son did a Bachelor of Business majoring in marketing and sports management. He works in the education sector now. I mean, he had phenomenal potential, but there's just no jobs there. And I could see it happening in the 1980s. I was, for a short time, was on an advisory board to the business schools of Australia. And I pointed out to them how the numbers of manufacturers were shrinking and those jobs were shrinking. What on earth are they doing encouraging more and more young people to go and do marketing at university when there's no jobs for it? I mean, in the early days when I started working with Amcor, there were 240, 250 odd medium to large food and beverage manufacturers in Australia buying their product. By the time the mill closed in 2013, it was less than 40. So that's where the jobs have gone to. So young people's opportunities are, and where do they all think they should now get a job? In government. Government's the worst employer that you could ever wish to work for because it's abusive. Any employer, any organisation that isn't measuring and rewarding performance, by definition, is insensitive to its employees. That's where you have abusive workplace environments, which your survey of the Fraser Coast Regional Council highlighted in spades. I mean, I think the survey. I read a good part of it downloaded it from the parliamentary website. I think it was 530, 540 something odd employees were interviewed, and the hopelessness of the CEO and the senior management team was just diabolical. There for everyone to see, and she'd been there for God knows how long, and the whole of council sat there overviewing this disaster. If that isn't a failed, broken system that needs radical overhaul, and what in the hell is the Queensland government doing? What in the hell is that local government, what does it call itself?
LGAQ.
What is it? The Local Government Association? What the hell is it doing? Where it's supposed to be the advisory body helping mayors and councillors do their job, they're silently just perpetuating this disaster. They're running it like a business, from what I can see, for themselves. It's just tragic, and these regions suffer. And the poor average punter out there who goes and votes every 3 years hasn't got a bloody clue what's really going on. And so they make decisions on whether... I just picked up was Googling something, and they make decisions on whether or not the mayor goes to an Anzac Day ceremony somewhere nearby them. I mean, the decisions are not made on the basis of who is capable to actually, and who is committed to trying to turn this disaster around. They're made in the business of whether or not you're perceived to have gone to an Anzac Day ceremony to support the local community. I mean, I mean, Churchill said that democracy was a very flawed system, just that we haven't come up with anything better. He was nothing's changed.
So, speaking with that, with your time in America and Trump, you've been over there when he got in, and the media didn't think he would. So that's happening more and more.
That's right.
On the
why wouldn't it? I mean, the ability, because no one has a landline any longer, and people's lifestyles have changed dramatically, and there's so much less easily defined and accessible. Surveying is very much more fraught and dangerous, and it only takes 2 or 3% one way to change the government. So the notion of believing that in the outcome of what a poll says is now today is ludicrous. But I mean, Trump. There are two things that I observe. I mean, it's wonderful not living in any one country, because my wife is Chinese, and I've just come from China to here, and you get a perspective that when you live in one place you don't get, and the thing that I've observed is just how badly misunderstood Trump is, both in his own country and here. Both how badly misunderstood China is, how badly misunderstood the electorate, both in Australia and indeed the United States, how badly that's misunderstood. I mean, people are talking about left versus right, and more recently they've been talking about generational change. What I've observed both in the United States and Australia is that it's basically become the producers versus the parasites and the passengers. So you've got basically two. The society is always split, and parties tend to be aligned with one of those two groups. The producers is obviously those aligned with business and freedoms and liberty and all those things, and the parasites and passengers obviously align with those who don't work or who attend the government and draw a monumental salary in a totally unaccountable fashion. And what's happened in the United States and in Australia is those representing the parasites and the passengers have recognised that they've just got a promise to give them anything, and that they've come to the view that's how they're going to get elected. They are misreading it in both places, because there are more producers, particularly in the United States, because small business people, the salary structure is nothing. I mean, the average wage in the United States is less than well under $15. It's around
an hour.
It's around $10 an hour. Less in some areas is the base wage. In some places, the base wage is less than $8 an hour, but most would be earning in the 8 to 12 region. In Australia, it's almost $20 an hour, the minimum. The absolute bare minimum. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, and that's creating a wage structure that guarantees that small businesses will close. You've only got to look here on the Fraser Coast. because I go away for long periods of time and I come back, and just the number of places that I used to go to have breakfast, because I try to stay away from McDonald's and Hungry Jack's and those sort of places and go to independently owned little cafes and so on. But the numbers of those that have closed is phenomenal, and it's the same in Brisbane, and so it pushes people into the Hungry Jack's. I mean, I've still found places along the waterfront, the Esplanade. There's still places where you can get a breakfast and so on, and it's a better breakfast than you get at Hungry Jack's. It costs a bit more, but you get a hell of a lot more for your dollar. I mean, I can't believe that they call it a Big Mac. It is shrunk to being marginally larger than a thimble. I mean, it's just laughable. So, you know, it's and similarly, the independent stores have never been. There's now a battle of the titans between Woolworths, Coles, Aldi, Costco's coming here. There's another mob coming in as well, which I find pretty funny because this marketplace is not that big to fight over, but they seem to be doing so. That's where the battle now is. The battle used to be between Woolworths, Coles, and the independents, which was through a number of distributors who had their retail chains. You know,
that's right.
I remember Jack Butler at one stage had about 13% of the Queensland grocery market.
Jack the Slasher.
You know, they've gone completely. I mean, it's IGA and a couple of other little groups that try to carry the can, but they're operating on a convenience basis now, as opposed to being a wide range, long trading hour business. So they're not really competitors for the Woolworths and Coles any longer. I mean,
so in America, Trump and the fake news stuff.
Well, it is fake news. I mean. And they're totally unprintable. There was a wonderful YouTube that I just caught purely by accident when Nancy Pelosi, who was the leader of the Democrat Party in the House, said, "This is how we create the news." She said, and she's there. If you Google Nancy Pelosi on YouTube, you'll find this, or do a YouTube search for it. She says, "We tell a lie about Trump or whoever. Because the media support us, they pick up that lie and they report it, which then makes it true. So we then come back and quote the media and say it has to be true because it's in the media." And that's how they stage their campaigns against Trump. I mean, Trump is not a terribly admirable human being. He is, in my view, something of a grub. And he certainly doesn't tell the truth, but I've never found a politician, the moment their lips started to move, didn't start lying. He's just less careful with his lies than others are. They all tell lies. It's just that, as I say, he doesn't bring the same care factor to it or indeed anything else. But the thing that he does stand for, which Americans, certainly outside of the major cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York, the average American who lives outside of those places, which is where America actually is, they do understand, is that he actually is for smaller government. He is not for bigger government. He is for, to use his vernacular, draining the swamp. The thing that Americans don't understand is their swamp is not only in Washington. Their swamp is in their own counties and their own cities. I mean, I've worked a lot with the swamp, the county and city swamp, that third level of government. They actually have 4 levels of government, which makes them even more inefficient than we are here. And they're thoroughly corrupted. I mean, the good old boy network. I mean, the Republican Party doesn't really support Trump all that well because draining the swamp is taking away their influence as well. And the good old boys don't want that to happen. But he is such a powerful force now. And as I say, totally. The tragedy is he doesn't have more resources available to him to develop good strategies for government. But he's by far and away the best option that the voter has over there. I mean, the Democrats. In fact, if you read what John F. Kennedy said in the early 1960s before he was assassinated, and you read what Trump says today, they're almost a mirror image one of the other. I mean, the Democrat Party of today is unrecognisable from that of the Kennedy era. The Democrat Party, I mean, Kennedy would not have contemplated giving illegals any kind of freedom in doing anything other than sending them back.
Mm.
It's less than a decade since the Democrats were arguing the same thing. Obama is on the record as saying they're going to be sent back. We've got to clean them out, got to get rid of them, and so on and so forth, because they're a massive problem.
Yeah, yeah.
And they put a massive burden on the American economy.
Well, that's so.
But what does Pelosi and co want to do? They want to give them, not only don't want to send them back, they want to give them a vote, free home, or free housing, free education, and free health that no American gets, because they believe they will vote Democrat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it almost has gotten like that here with the Labor Party chasing after the Greens down that foxhole, which that backfired. Fortunately.
Yes, yeah. So that wall, we hear about the wall.
Yeah.
To me, it makes sense to build it.
Well, the interesting thing is every major Democrat supporter who's got money lives behind a wall.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole of Hollywood lives behind a wall. Obama lives behind a wall. They all recognise that if you want to be secure, you have a wall. And it's the same for, and it's not beyond America's resources. They have to. The estimate is that there's over 20 million illegals in the United States, and they put a massive burden on the economy. So it's all very doable, and plenty of people want it.
Yeah.
Contrary to what the left-leaning limousine left of the media and Hollywood suggest.
The limousine left.
The limousine left.
Yeah.
Bless their cotton socks.
Yeah. All right. I reckon there's plenty in that, Jace. We'll do you again.
Sure.
Just as this begins to unfold. So what we're doing is building up about